Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 147th meeting of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. This is a special session on the issue of political prisoners in Russia. Today we are holding a hearing on the human rights situation in Russia following the release of the Perseus Strategies report on the Kremlin's political prisoners. The issue of political prisoners and the continuously deteriorating human rights situation in Russia is one that unites members of this committee from across party lines. A number of us are members of the all-party Raoul Wallenberg Caucus on International Political Prisoners Advocacy Project, spearheaded by Professor Kotler, who is with us here today, and today's report is close to our hearts, especially after this committee's report and unanimous adoption of Canada's Magnitsky legislation. Before us today are Vladimir Kara-Murza, Chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom, the Honourable Erwin Kotler, Founding Chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, Jared Genser, Managing Partner of Perseus Strategies, and Natalia Arno, President of the Free Russia Foundation. Mr. Kara-Murza, welcome back to this committee. If you'd like to proceed with your opening statement, followed by short statements from your colleagues, we'll then, of course, move to rounds of questions from the committee members. Mr. Kara-Murza, please proceed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It is an honor to be back before your committee. Thank you for this opportunity and for holding this very important hearing today. On December 10th, 1975, Oslo City Hall hosted the annual Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. Everything seemed in order, except for one detail. The laureate, Andrei Sakharov, was not present. Neither were his four guests of honor. None of them were allowed to travel by the Soviet government. In his Nobel lecture, which was read out by his wife, Yelena Bonner, Sakharov wrote, and I quote, "I would ask you to remember that all prisoners of conscience and all political prisoners in my country share with me the honor of the Nobel Prize," end of quote. He listed 126 names. This was not everyone, but it gave an idea. Today, according to the Memorial Human Rights Center, there are 296 political and religious prisoners in Russia. This too is not everyone, just those who fit the strict criteria defined by the Council of Europe. But it also gives an idea. Dans son discours pour le prix de Nobel en 1960,
for his Nobel Prize, he listed 126 names. That was not everyone by far, but it gave an idea. Today, according to the Memorial Human Rights Center, there are 296 political and religious prisoners in Russia. This too is not everyone, just those who fit the strict criteria set by the Council of Europe. But it also gives an idea.
Are real people who are being held in prisons, penal colonies, detention centers, and under house arrest, having committed no crime against the law, only crossed the imposed lines of Vladimir Putin's regime. Oleg Sentsov, a filmmaker from Crimea who protested against the annexation. Anastasia Shevchenko, a single mother and an activist of the Open Russia movement, who became the first person arrested for belonging to an undesirable organization. Alexei Pichugin, the remaining hostage of the Yukos affair, who after 16 years is Russia's longest-serving political prisoner. Oyub Titiev, a human rights activist, who has documented the egregious abuses of Ramzan Kadyrov's regime in Chechnya. Yuri Dmitriev, a leader of Memorial in Karelia, who has uncovered mass graves from Stalin-era executions. Just 5 names out of 296. And there's a new one, literally in the last 2 days. Ivan Golunov, one of Russia's best-known investigative journalists, arrested on fabricated drug charges. In the last 4 years, the number of political prisoners in Russia has increased 6-fold. Their continued incarceration violates not only Russia's constitution, but our international obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights, the OSCE Vienna Concluding Document, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, among many others. International bodies, including the European Court of Human Rights and the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, have repeatedly condemned these incarcerations. But appealing to the law is as futile an endeavor in Vladimir Putin's Russia as it was in Leonid Brezhnev's Soviet Union. The only court that matters is the court of global public opinion. Just as in the 1970s, the best hope, the best defense for political prisoners in our country is international attention. Back then, prime ministers and presidents of democratic nations put this issue high on the agenda. Prime ministers and presidents in their summit meetings with leaders of the Soviet Union would often start by putting the lists of political prisoners on the table. Successive American administrations have successfully negotiated the exchange or release of prominent Soviet prisoners of conscience, including Vladimir Dzhemluga, Vladimir Bukovsky, Alexander Ginsburg, and Yuri Orlov. In 1978, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau personally handed Brezhnev the legal brief on the case of Anatoly Sharansky, prepared by the man I have the privilege of sharing this table with, Professor Erwin Kotler. What was saving us, Sharansky recalled, was the fact that all these important people in the West were supporting us in every speech. They knew our names. End of quote. Nothing of the sort is happening today. Whatever else Western leaders discuss at their meetings with Putin, the issue of political prisoners seems to be absent, as if it is normal that in the year 2019, a European country is holding hundreds of people in prison for their political views or their religious affiliation. It is time to break the silence. One of the principal documents of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which both Canada and Russia are full members, holds that, and I quote, "Issues relating to human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy, and the rule of law are matters of direct and legitimate concern to all participating states and do not belong exclusively to the internal affairs of the state concerned." End of quote. Canada should uphold this commitment. It should raise the issue of political prisoners, not in general terms, but with specific names and specific cases in every contact with Russian officials, from top-level summits to ministerial meetings to parliamentary assemblies. Ending the shameful practice of political incarceration and releasing those unjustly held should be a prerequisite to any meaningful dialogue with the Kremlin. De quoi que les leaders occidentaux parlent avec Poutine, il paraît que le problème des prisonniers.
It seems that we are not talking about political prisoners, as if it is normal that in the year 2019, a European country is holding hundreds of people in prison for their political views or their religious affiliation. It is time to break the silence. One of the principal documents, Canada should uphold this commitment. It should raise this issue of political prisoners not in general terms, but with specific names and specific cases in every contact with Russian officials, from top-level summits to ministerial meetings and parliamentary assemblies.
In October of 2017, this House unanimously passed the Sergei Magnitsky Law, which brought much-needed personal accountability to human rights violators by subjecting them to asset freezes and visa bans. It is my hope that Canada will use this law to sanction those responsible for politically motivated imprisonment in Russia, starting with Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika. Just over a decade after Sakharov's Nobel lecture, nearly all of the prisoners he named were free. This was a result both of the winds of change that swept our country and the principled position of the democratic world. There will come a day when the current political prisoners are free as well, and when Russia finally puts the shameful legacy of political incarceration behind her. Until that day comes, I hope that our partners in the international community will continue to speak up for justice on behalf of those who are deprived of it at home. I thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Genser, are you going to be delivering short remarks?
Yes. Good afternoon, Chairman Levitt, distinguished members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be with you all again here today. Last month, my public interest law firm published this report, The Kremlin's Political Prisoners Advancing a Political Agenda While Crushing Dissent. It's the first comprehensive report on the topic, and it's some 280 pages with 1,700 footnotes. It's also co-sponsored by the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the Free Russia Foundation, Human Rights Foundation, and Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. I'd like to briefly highlight the unique features of the report for you, and we have copies for all of you as well. First, using Memorial's vetted list of prisoners, we've identified 8 categories of prisoners held by the Kremlin at the direction of Vladimir Putin, including political opponents, Ukrainian activists and citizens, civil society activists, journalists, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, alleged spies, and LGBT persons in Chechnya. As noted earlier, the number of the Kremlin's political prisoners has increased sixfold in the last 4 years, from 50 to almost 300 today. Among this group of prisoners is my client, Alexei Pichugin, the Kremlin's longest-standing political prisoner, whose served more than 16 years on fabricated murder charges, but in fact his arrest was simply a first move by Vladimir Putin against the Yukos oil company. And Pichugin remains in jail today because he refuses as a matter of conscience to implicate its major shareholders, including Mikhail Khodorkovsky, in crimes that neither he nor they committed. And in fact, just in the last few weeks, we released an opinion by the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which found, in fact, that, quote, the discrimination of Mr. Pichugin by the government on the basis of his association with the Yukos company is the only plausible explanation for his arrest, detention, and imprisonment, end quote. And it called for his immediate release. Second, in our report, we've completed the first comprehensive review of the domestic laws used to imprison political opponents of the regime, both laws that are facially invalid as incompatible with international law and those used as pretext, as well as administrative provisions used to threaten, intimidate, or harass real or imagined threats to Putin's regime. Third, we analyzed the wide array of international law violations committed by the Kremlin in imprisoning political prisoners. Fourth, we look at the international response and domestic response from the media, civil society groups, and political parties to the imprisonment of the Kremlin's political prisoners and the playbook for how the Kremlin responds to this criticism. Fifth, we examine the wide array of ways in which political prisoners have been released, both historically and in recent years, including parole pardons, prisoner swaps, amnesties, and reduced sentences and releases for health, among others, as this can provide a roadmap to see what might be done to help the current crop of political prisoners. Sixth, we identify across the list of political prisoners the names of judges, prosecutors, and investigators in their cases. From there, we identified a group of 16 perpetrators with command or line responsibility for imprisoning political prisoners in Russia. Those responsible at a system-wide level include people like Vladimir Putin, Yuri Chaika, the prosecutor general, and Gennady Kornienko, the director of the Federal Penitentiary Service, among others. Canada has actually already sanctioned 4 of the 8 on our list of those responsible for command responsibility, but those that I mentioned, as well as 8 judges, prosecutors, and investigators involved in the most number of cases, have not yet been sanctioned. And finally, in our report, we present 5 recommendations for the international community. Each of these recommendations includes more detailed actions, but at a high level, these recommended actions fall in the categories of targeted financial sanctions and travel bans on perpetrators, joint actions across multilateral institutions, highlighting the plight of these prisoners, joint civil society efforts, and media engagement. It is worth briefly focusing on our section on perpetrators. We're advocating for this group of perpetrators to be put onto global Magnitsky lists, and this is in fact why our report has 1,700 footnotes. We received feedback from many global sanctions offices, including here in Canada, that given limited resources, they rely exclusively on credible civil society, media, and other reports on human rights abuses in any given country when investigating potential targets to sanction. And by presenting a highly organized and meticulously assembled group of sources to verify the evidence that we have presented in our report, we hope this will enable global sanctions offices to have in one place all the information they should require to investigate and verify our claims. Having represented political prisoners for more than 20 years in my career, I can say from experience that the greatest fear of any political prisoner is to be forgotten. And we hope that the Parliament here in Canada will urge the Government of Canada to impose a set of sanctions against the group of perpetrators responsible for imprisoning the Kremlin's political prisoners. Rolling out a set of sanctions of those responsible for the entire system would not only benefit political prisoners in Russia, but it would send a strong signal to other authoritarian regimes that imprison political prisoners that their systems could be next sanctioned. I know that freeing the Kremlin's political prisoners might at this moment seem like an impossible task. It is incumbent on all of us who live in free societies to show the pictures of these prisoners and tell their individual stories, just as we show the pictures of the perpetrators and demand they be held accountable. And it is worth remembering that, as Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it is done. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end of our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genser. Now, Ms. Arno, if you would care to give a statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for taking your time to hear our testimony regarding a significant and concerning increase in the number of political prisoners held in Putin's Russia today. We are grateful that you offered us this hearing to talk about the report, an astonishing, detailed, and tragic report that we've produced, and that you are open to hear how the Canadian Parliament and Canadian people can act with solidarity and help put an end to my country's national disgrace. Out of the current number, which is a very conservative estimates, 296 political prisoners in Russia, over 220 people are prosecuted for religious beliefs. There is a large number, over 40 people, Ukrainian hostages of the Kremlin, including Oleg Sentsov, a filmmaker, torn up inside because he's watched his homeland of Crimea swallowed up by an all-powerful nation-state reminiscent of the Soviet Union takeover. We have two groups called New Greatness and network consisting of a dozen of young people who just would get together and discuss political news. We have a single mom who just wanted to organize a debate. We have a professor who participated in a professional discussion. His colleague died in prison for the same charge. We have a historian devoted to exposing the truth about Russia's past. And many, many, many others. We have people in jail for just simple tweets or Facebook posts. The seemingly random use of prison sentences isn't really random at all. It's actually the point. If a mom or a filmmaker or a kid playing Pokemons can be jailed, then everyone has to figure they too can be facing a prison sentence for crossing the Kremlin's worldview. Were any of them guilty, it hardly mattered. Fear and terror are the point. An atomized society of scared people is much more easily dominated. And this is how Kremlin wants to keep its over 140 million people under control by arbitrarily singling out a few hundred people and thus sowing fear in others. I have an affinity with the prisoners that extends beyond the fact that I personally know many of them and that their stories tear at my heart. I myself could have ended up on this list of political prisoners for my pro-democracy work and activity. I could be serving my 7th year in jail, and there would be one more name and one more story in this report. My crime? I worked for an American democracy promotion organization. They sought free and fair elections and same rules for candidates who had different ideals from the regime on how to better run a country. For that, I was given a sad choice of leaving my country and my heritage or face 20 years in jail for state treason. It was a very easy choice, but the hardest decision in my life. But the Russian authorities miscalculated because I'm still in the fight, and that's why I'm here talking to you today. I hope I don't look to you as a dangerous criminal who should be beaten and tortured in a Russian prison, but it's the same for the others who are being politically prosecuted. They are nothing more than people who believe in a better Russia. Our report catalogues the number who are in jail today, but behind each number, there is a human life, a human story, a human tragedy. And the report tells us not only about the categories of prisoners, but about concrete people too. However, rather than talking about this report today, it would be much more pleasant to talk about new documentaries that filmmaker Oleg Sentsov has produced, or about new articles that a journalist, Igor Rudnikov, has written, or about new research that Professor Bobashev has conducted. But instead of that, we are discussing people's life and the cruelty of the regime destroying these lives. In a civilized world, we shouldn't tolerate that political prisoners exist in the 21st century. We shouldn't tolerate that fair trials are exceptions, but torture is common and widely spread. We shouldn't tolerate that people who want free and fair elections are in jail, and those who falsify them are not. We shouldn't tolerate when those people who speak out and want Russia to be free and democratic, they are in jail, but those who impose censorship and conduct propaganda are not. And also, we shouldn't tolerate when people who dare to criticize the corrupt and criminal Putin's regime are in jail, but corrupt officials engaged in the criminal affairs inside Russia and beyond are not. And I think you all know that a confident leader such as Putin would see no reason to jail his opponents, and that a leader who claims great popularity should find no need to worry about a single mother or about two young people who just made 2 posters, 30 flyers, and purchased a megaphone. They shouldn't be worried about people's tweet and Facebook posts or those who catch Pokemons and blog about it. These are the signs of a desperate dictator, and I hope you view them the same way. My colleagues and I are again very grateful to listening to us, and we hope you will consider placing sanctions on those who directly are involved into such gross human rights violations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, we'll go to Professor Erwin Kotler, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me so I can take part in this endeavor for justice.
Of the global coalition to free the Kremlin's political prisoners and the launch of the first ever landmark report on this matter. Now, while we know of Russia's external aggression, Ukraine, Crimea, Venezuela, we are largely unaware of the domestic repression that is taking place as we meet, which includes the criminalization of fundamental freedoms of religion, expression, assembly, association, and political participation, of the persecution and prosecution of the leaders of Russia's courageous civil society, political activists, journalists, human rights defenders, Ukrainians, religious leaders, LGBT community, and the like. Third, the six-fold increase of political prisoners from 50 to 296 in just the last 4 years. And finally, the culture of impunity, where the very architects of repression named in the report are not only not held accountable for their criminality, but have even, in some cases, been rewarded for them. May I conclude, therefore, with a number of recommendations for this body, and I'll do so for reasons of time in a series of one-liners. Number one, combat the culture of criminality and impunity by imposing Magnitsky sanctions on the architects of repression detailed and documented in our report. I remind you that Boris Nemtsov, the courageous leader of Russian democracy, came before this committee, came to Canada, supported Magnitsky sanctions, was ultimately assassinated in Russia, but always spoke of Magnitsky sanctions as being the most pro-Russian legislation that one could enact, because such legislation was on behalf of the Russian people. Two, take the lead in multilateral engagement, whether it be the UN, the OSCE, the G20, and the like. Three, hold Russia to account for its breach of international treaty violations, where Canada is a state party with Russia to these treaties, and so they're violating obligations made to us. Four, take up the case and cause of the Kremlin's political prisoners, something that I've been doing for the last 40 years, being inspired by them. It began with Anatoly Sharansky, released after 8.5 years, continued with Vladimir Nikitin, the environmental activist who was the last political prisoner before the Putin regime, but interestingly enough, was imprisoned by Putin, who then was the head of the FSB, or the former KGB. And finally, right now, Anastasia Savchenko, one of the most recent courageous Russian political prisoners that I have the honor to take up her case as her international legal counsel. Let us also remember that even if we don't succeed immediately in bringing about their release, what experience has shown is that we help to relieve the conditions in detention, the tortures and the otherwise inflictions that they may be suffering. Number five, support the courageous Russian civil society. Let them know that they are not alone. And finally, as we approach the 40th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, whose organizing theme was, in Principle 7, the right to know and act upon their rights, those who undertook to know and act upon their rights in Russia are now languishing in prison. As a leading sponsor of the Helsinki Final Act, we have an obligation to hold the Russian leadership, the Kremlin leadership, accountable. As Vladimir said, and I'll close with his own words, it is time to break the silence and do so in the pursuit of justice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Professor Kotler, and thank you to all of you for your powerful statements here before us this afternoon. With that, we'll go straight into the first round of questions, and we will begin with MP Jenris, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today, but more importantly, thank you for your courage, your ongoing advocacy in the face of great difficulty. Before I get into questions, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to give the committee notice that I intend to move this week motions with respect to independent investigation of allegations of genocide against Tamils in Sri Lanka at the end of civil war, and also a motion with respect to the listing of the IRGC as a terrorist entity under the criminal code. I wanted to give the committee information about that. And back to the testimony here. There's two questions I wanted to ask, and I'll put those out there and then let whoever wants to respond, and we can go through it that way. The first question, Mr. Karamirza, you spoke about political and religious prisoners, which is different terminology than we sometimes use in this area. I wonder if you can share a bit more with the committee about the anatomy of religious persecution in Russia, the co-opting of the Orthodox Church, the challenges that are faced by religious minorities, Tatar Muslims, evangelical Christians, and others, and how that kind of works its way out in our specific response to those issues. Secondly, on the issue of Magnitsky sanctions, clearly an important tool, but it's a tool in the government's toolbox, and it's only as good as it is used. And some points were made about people we need to add to our sanctions list. I'd like to hear your thoughts more broadly at a policy level. What can we do as Parliament to ensure that this tool is used more often? There are some terrible human rights abusers in the world where nobody's been listed yet under the Magnitsky Act, and there's clearly need for more people to be listed. So, is there a mechanism change that can strengthen the use of that tool? Are there things that we can do as a Parliament to more effectively ensure that the minister or the government of the day isn't, let's say, holding off on sanctioning people who should be sanctioned?
Mr. Chairman, could I answer the question? Thank you so much for both of the questions. On the first question of religious prisoners, most of the people, and as Natalia mentioned, it's more than 200 out of 296 people are there as religious rather than political prisoners. And the vast majority of those are either adherents of a Muslim organization called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a radical but peaceful Islamic movement, and increasingly the numbers include also adherents of the Jehovah's Witnesses congregations. One of the latest political prisoners is actually a Danish citizen by the name of Mr. Christensen, who is one of the leaders of the Jehovah's Witness congregation in the city of Ariol. So that's you're right. That is a relatively new term in our discourse, but of course, as part of the Helsinki Final Acts commitments and other OSCE commitment, not to mention the European Convention on Human Rights, the freedom of religion is one of those obligations that the Russian government has undertaken. And in the case of these religious prisoners, that obligation is clearly being violated. A very important second part of your question on the Magnitsky Act. I have been involved in this work now for almost a decade, starting in the US, then Canada, then several countries of the European Union. And we always find the same model when it relates to the Magnitsky legislation, and I think it would be fair to say that this was a model that applied at least partially here in Canada too, where you have the executive branch, the government and diplomatic service, who are initially very much opposed to this principle. It's, realpolitik is not a new concept, it's a resilient one, it's been around for a long time, so it's perhaps not surprising that it still retains somewhat strength. But we also found in every one of the 6 countries that have the Magnitsky legislation on the books, and that certainly includes Canada, we found that a principled cross-party support from parliamentarians in the end overcame that resistance and made sure that the legislation, A, was adopted, and B, is being implemented. Because as you pointed out exactly rightly in your question, those are 2 different things as well. And for example, one of the 6 countries where the Magnitsky legislation exists, the United Kingdom, has had it now for 1 year, since June of 2018, and the total number of people sanctioned under the Magnitsky legislation in the UK is precisely 0. And so one of the things that we're seeing increasingly happen over there in Britain is pressure from Parliament. And that also what it took initially to move the process ahead in the United States. I'll give you just one example. General Alexander Bastrykin, who is a top law enforcement official in the Putin regime, the chairman of the Russian Investigative Committee, is not only somebody who's personally responsible for all the politically motivated prosecutions of recent years, like the Yukos affair and the Bolotnaya affair and the Navalny case and all the other ones, but a few years ago, he personally, so we're talking about the highest law enforcement official in Putin's government, he personally took a leading independent journalist in Russia called Sergei Sokolov from Novaya Gazeta into a forest near Moscow. He walked him out of the car, took him into the forest, and said to him, if your newspaper continues to publish what you're publishing, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to bury you right here in this forest. And by the way, guess who's going to investigate? I'm the chairman of the investigation committee. And this is not in dispute, by the way. This is not allegedly or admittedly. He admitted this, he had done this. He also said sorry the next week. But I don't think that cuts it quite as a level of responsibility for a senior government official who threatens to murder a journalist. And it took several years and a lot of pressure from the United States Congress, from both major political parties, to finally convince the United States government to sanction this individual. And he has been sanctioned in the year 2017. He's also sanctioned in Canada straight away. By the way, in October of 2017, you passed a law, and I believe in November was the first batch of the Magnitsky designations, and General Bastrykin was on that list. So I actually find myself in a rare position when I'm sitting in the parliament of a country that instead of criticizing, I would like to commend, because wherever I go now to other Western European parliaments to talk about the needs for the Magnitsky legislation there, I always use Canada as an example of a country that both has passed a law unanimously, but also that is implementing it. But of course, there's always more to do. And those people that we are talking about today, starting with Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika, I think are very obvious glaring omissions. In fact, it is mind-boggling, but Chaika, who has been either Justice Minister or Prosecutor General for the entire 20 years of Vladimir Putin's rule, and as such has been responsible for some of the most egregious cases of politically motivated prosecution, has so far not been sanctioned by any country, any of the 6 countries where the Magnitsky Law exists, including Canada. And so I think it would be important to have parliamentary pressure on the government here in Canada to sanction those people who are responsible for politically motivated prosecutions, as well as those who are responsible for politically motivated assassinations. 3 weeks ago, the United States government took a very important step of sanctioning, under their Magnitsky Law, a key organizer in the assassination of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, a Russian Interior Ministry official named Ruslan Geremeyev. Lithuania and the United States are 2 countries that have so far sanctioned this individual. And I think it would be very powerful and very important if Canada did the same. There's no more gross human rights abuse than murder of somebody who dedicated his life to stand up for freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. And because we are witnessing for more than 4 years now a very high-level cover-up in Russia when it comes to anything related to bringing the organizers and masterminds of the assassination of Boris Nemtsov to justice, we are hoping that those countries that have the Magnitsky Law use it to end the impunity for those people. After all, that's what Magnitsky Law was intended to do, to end the impunity for those who are shielded and protected, for those human rights abusers who are shielded and protected by their governments.
Thank you very much. We shall now move to MP Czesnewski, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Mr. Kara-Murza, once again to the Foreign Affairs Committee. And you referenced Mr. Sakharov and the 126 prisoners of conscience during the Soviet period. Very few of those individuals are still living. There's very few of them are still with us. One individual who spent 15 years between 1966 and 1986 in the Gulag system appeared before a committee 3 weeks ago, the iconic Mustafa Dzhemiliev. He spent 15 years in the Gulag for demanding the right of return of the Crimean Tatars to their ancestral homeland. And in his testimony before the committee, and it was 3 weeks ago, virtually on the 75th anniversary of the Shurgun, he asked that Canada's Parliament recognize what happened to the Crimean Tatars under Stalin as a genocide. Mr. Kara-Murza, would you agree that what happened to the Crimean Tatars was in fact a genocide?
Thank you so much for the question. And Mustafa Dzhemiliev, somebody that I admire immensely, is one of the legends and the pillars of the human rights movement in the Soviet Union. And by the way, Andrei Sakharov himself, as you know well, has been engaged in the movement for the restoration of the rights of the Crimean Tatar people, which was the last ethnic group in the Soviet Union to have their rights restored, to be officially rehabilitated. It took until 1989. Most of the rehabilitations took place in the 50s. And most of the deported nations, including from the Baltic states, were allowed to return under Khrushchev in the 50s. That was not the case for the Crimean Tatars. They were the last ones to have justice restored to them. And now, of course, we're seeing that justice denied again. And so, yes, to answer your question, I think it would be very important to make such a recognition. I think one of the gravest mistakes that the democratic government in Russia made in the early 1990s was to fail or refuse to conduct a full-scale trial or a truth commission, whatever you want to call it, against the crimes of the totalitarian communist regime. I think there will still come a time when we do this, because without turning fully the page on the totalitarian past, it is not possible to move forward. And so it's very important to remember that the Stalin regime has been involved in mass crimes committed against so many nations and so many ethnic groups living in the Soviet Union, beginning, of course, with the Russian people. Numerically, the biggest victims of the Stalin regime were the Russian people, and I think it's important to remember that. And so while this recognition for now is lacking domestically, I think it's important that democratic nations and international communities steps in to express that solidarity in such a form.
Thank you, Mr. Kara-Murza. Chair, I'd like to give a notice of motion that, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and based upon the witness testimony of Mr. Mustafa Jamiliev on May 16th, 2019, and of Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza today on June 10th, 2019, the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development immediately report to the House the following. 1. That in support of the historic truth, and as requested by Mustafa Jamiliev, the Crimean Tatar deportation of 1944 be recognized as a genocide perpetrated by Soviet dictator Stalin, and that May 18th be designated a day of remembrance for the Crimean Tatar deportation, the Shurgun. And I have it translated into French as well.
Thank you. And you still have 2 minutes left on your question time.
Thank you. Mr. Kara-Murza, this is perhaps a difficult question because you yourself have been targeted for assassination. Thank goodness you survived. Many of us knew your very good friend, Boris Nemtsov. Mr. Kotler knew him personally as well. And today we're talking about the 296 political prisoners currently incarcerated in Russia by the Kremlin. But how many people have gotten away literally with murder? Some of the best sons and daughters of the Russian people. How many people are no longer with us? And do you have a list, or is there a list that's been prepared for sanctioning under the Magnitsky? You referenced one of the assassins involved in the Boris Nemtsov assassination. Is there a list of all of those involved in the assassination of human rights figures, journalists, democratic right figures in Russia?
Mr. Zhuzhnevsky, thank you so much for this question, and thank you for bringing the focus to this issue, because while our main topic of discussion today are political prisoners, I think it's important to remember that there is a price even higher than long-term imprisonment to be paid by people who dare to stand up for truth and justice in Russia and who dare to stand up against the Putin regime. And Boris Nemtsov, who was a dear and close friend of mine, who was the most prominent and the most effective and the most powerful leader of the Russian democratic opposition, has paid that price on the evening of February 27th, 2015, when he was gunned down on a bridge, literally in front of the Kremlin. And what we have been seeing in these nearly 4.5 years that have passed since that wretched night is a top-level cover-up orchestrated by the Putin regime in relation to those who had organized and masterminded this assassination, the most high-profile political assassination in the modern history of Russia. And beyond the immediate perpetrators who were arrested and sentenced to prison, nobody else has faced any sort of accountability or justice. The man I referred to a few minutes ago, Russian Interior Ministry Major Ruslan Geremeyev, who is a key enforcer and key handler for Ramzan Kadyrov, the Kremlin-appointed leader in Chechnya. On 2 different occasions, Russian investigators had tried to indict him as in organizing the assassination because there was more than enough evidence. And on both of those occasions, General Alexander Bastrykin, whom I referred to earlier, the chief of the Russian Investigative Committee, has personally intervened to ban investigators from doing so. One of the most astonishing things about the Nemtsov case is that we pretty much know every single name of the people who have been involved in the assassination, at least to a certain level. I'm convinced that it goes higher. But at least to a certain very, very high level, we know those names, and those names have been voiced during investigation and trial. The lawyers representing the Nemtsov family and Zhana Nemtsova, whom you know personally, Mr. Nemtsov's daughter, have repeatedly intervened to get the Russian authorities to question these people. And every single time their appeals were rejected. Key evidence was withheld.
Thank you,
key persons
Mr.
of questions,
Karamurza.
not interest. And I just directly answering Mr. Zhizhnevsky's question, I think it's important to put on a record some of those names, because these names are known. Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen Republic. General Viktor Zolotov, the commander of Vladimir Putin's National Guard. Adam Delimkhanov, a member of the Russian State Duma for United Russia, Vladimir Putin's party. And of course, Major Ruslan Geremeyev, whom I mentioned already. In the absence of justice and accountability at home, it will be very important if those countries that have the Magnitsky legislation, including Canada, move to impose targeted sanctions on these individuals.
Thank you very much. MP Caron, please.
Bonjour et merci beaucoup pour.
Hello, and thank you for these very powerful testimonies. I think that the committee has shown how concerned it is by all of this issue. I don't know who's better able to respond as to the situation of people of the LGBTQ groups. We know there have been kidnappings and murders in 2017 and a new wave in 2019, which may not has attracted attention, but nonetheless is there. And Russia is simply turning away from this tragedy in Chechnya and elsewhere. Is it really incapable of acting? And what is the situation in terms of human rights in the rest of Russia for LGBTQ groups?
Well, very often the Kremlin tries not to put people for directly political in jail for directly political articles, and. Yes, there are especially so-called political articles like or extremism or terrorism or espionage or treason and things like that. But in case with LGBT, they try not to put them for that. They either try to plant drugs, weapons, or to charge them with some other crime, or also to try to force out from the country. This is one of the consequences of the Putin regime. So they deprive some people of lives, like Boris Nemtsov, like Anna Politkovskaya, Natalia Stemirova, Anastasia Markelova, Baburina, Stanislav Markelov, and many others. They deprive others of freedom, like all these at least 296 political prisoners. But many more they deprived of motherland. Like me and like all those people from LGBT communities that had to flee from Russia if they are not in jail for some other trumped-up charges.
Merci beaucoup de votre question. Comme vous savez, il y a eu
Thank you for your question. As you know, there have been two wars against Chechnya to force Chechnya to be a part of the Russian Federation. But the Chechnya of Ramzan Kadyrov is not a part of the Russian Federation, because even when speaking of human rights, which is absolutely a horrible situation in Vladimir Putin's Russia, Russia, and they're forbidden from assembly and all that. When speaking of Mr. Kadyrov and Chechnya, well, this is something from another planet. This is a medieval regime. There are tortures, murders, disappearances of people on a daily basis. You have to remember that opponents of Mr. Kadyrov have been killed not just in Chechnya, but in Dubai, in Russia, in Dubai, everywhere in the world. Whoever is against this guy and the people who were close to Ramzan Kadyrov were also included. So it's very important that we act against Kadyrov and his followers at the international level. He has been designated for the Magnitsky Law sanctions in Canada and in the United States as well. Sometimes he laughs. He says, I don't have any bank accounts. I have no interest and no money in the Western world. And maybe he is right. But on March 12 of this year, the House of Representatives of the United States passed a resolution, Res 156, which tasked the American government with investigating the assets of Mr. Kadyrov in the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, because he has a lot of money there, and he didn't laugh when that was passed. So it's important to speak about the interests of Kadyrov outside of Russia and Chechnya, because that is very important. Thank you. I would like to ask a question of Mr. Kotler. We have spoken about LGBTQ trampled rights. How do you react to the welcoming of refugees? Because persecution ought to force a lot of people to expatriate or to get away.
I think that it's very important concerning the LGBT community that the problem is that that community is not recognized as a political prisoner category. The members of that community and herself have trouble getting that recognition, because the nature of the prosecution could be worse if there was that recognition. But we could make that recognition. We could give that recognition. And it could be a means in our approach to Magnitsky. I want to say briefly concerning Magnitsky that we've imposed sanctions on 140 leaders of Venezuela and against Maduro himself, 17 in Saudi Arabia and in Sudan as well. But there are also 5 that are very important: the prosecutor, the Minister of Justice, the Interior Minister, the heads of prisons, and those who are involved in Nemtsov's assassination.
Move to MP Saini, please.
Good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much for coming. Mr. Karmers, I want to start with you if I could. Something happened last month in Europe, which a lot of people may not know. If we go back a little bit in history, we know that the Russian Federation applied to join the Council of Europe in 1992, and in 1996 that request was granted. As you're also aware, the European Court of Human Rights is the last place of recourse for those citizens in Russia who don't have recourse through their own courts, especially for politically sensitive cases. We also know that in 2015, Mr. Putin signed a law allowing the Russian government to ignore
rulings from the ECHR. We also know in June 2017, the Russian government stopped paying its contributions to the Council of Europe, and that was a sizable amount, as you can appreciate, almost 7% of their budget. We also know that last month, a meeting was held where 47 nations decided to allow Russia to continue on in the Council of Europe, and France and Germany were two countries that were really behind that proposal. So I'm wondering, I mean, knowing the history of what Russia has done, is this not a further setback of human rights in Russia, but also 47 European nations have in some ways indirectly supported that?
Thank you so much for the question, Mrs. Heine. And I will answer it in two different ways because there are two sides to this story. Those of us, from the Russian democratic opposition and from Russian civil society, whenever we meet our Western friends and counterparts, we always emphasize that it's important to differentiate between the regime and the people in Russia. The Kremlin does not equate Russia. They're two different things. And so it's in the spirit of that I will answer your question in two different ways. First, I think it would be a catastrophe if Russia were to be ejected from the Council of Europe. As you said correctly, as a Russian citizen, the closest place I have to find justice is at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And I have that right because I'm a citizen of a Council of Europe member state. We also have the legal protections of the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, the Putin regime, as I don't need to tell you, is ignoring the decisions of the European Court and also violating key obligations under the European Convention. But that's not the reason to deprive us from them at all. It is very important, I can tell you, as somebody I have myself a case before the European Court of Human Rights. Many prominent opponents of the Kremlin have won their cases at the European Court of Human Rights. That includes the late Boris Nemtsov, that includes Alexei Navalny, that includes Mikhail Khodorkovsky, that includes many, many others, including some political prisoners as well, like Alexei Pichugin, who has two European Court of Human Rights cases against him. Now, that's important, first of all, because, nothing is permanent, and Mr. Putin and his regime are not forever, and when things change, those decisions, of course, will be implemented. Second, because I cannot tell you how important it is to know that the law is on our side, and not just to know it because that's what we think, but because there is a decision from the highest court of law in Europe telling us that that is the case. And so I think there, frankly, could be nothing worse than ejecting Russia from the Council of Europe and leaving 140 million people without the protections of the European Convention and the European Court of Human Rights. The second part of my answer would be that I think that the decision to restore the full rights of the so-called parliamentary delegation of Russia at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe is a very flawed decision. For many years, long before Crimea, by the way, many of us have been advocating for the suspension of the voting rights of the so-called Russian delegation at the Parliamentary Assembly, not because they represent Russia, but because they do not represent Russia. Because astonishingly, if you read the reports from the Council of Europe itself, going back 2 decades, you will find, if you look at those reports, that every single national election in Russia since the year 2003, beginning in 2003 onwards, has been ruled as neither free nor fair nor democratic by the Council of Europe itself. The last time we had something close to a free and fair election was in 2000, so almost 20 years ago. And so, with the one hand, the Council of Europe has said that the elections are not free or fair, and on the other hand, they have accepted the results of those fake elections and those representatives, quote-unquote, elected in them as the bona fide representatives of the Russian people. To me, there's no logic to this. And on a more specific note, in 2 weeks' time, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe will hold its summer session in Strasbourg. That will be the session where the Russian delegation will most likely return and take up their seats again. That will also be the session where a parliamentarian from Lithuania, Emanuelis Zingeris, who is the Council of Europe's special rapporteur on the case of Boris Nemtsov's assassination and the investigation into it, will be presenting his report into the Nemtsov case that he spent the last 2 years preparing. The Russian delegation has refused any kind of cooperation with this report. They have forbidden him from entering the country. They have ignored his requests, his phone calls, and his messages. And when he physically went to a post office and sent a letter to the Russian parliament, the letter was returned to him with a stamp from the Russian postal office reading unknown address. And I'm not making this up. That's going to be in the Council of Europe report. And so I think that condition number one, before even talking about the return of the Russian delegation to the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, will be their full in unequivocal cooperation with the Zinger's report on the Boris Nemtsov case. But unfortunately, that is not happening.
Thank you very much. I'll share my remaining time with MP Shevchensky.
Thank you, Mr. Saini.
It's a very short amount of time.
So let me get right at it. We heard 3 weeks ago about the slow ethnocide of the Crimean Tatars within occupied Crimea, but what many people in the West don't realize is that the Russian Federation has many autonomous republics with indigenous peoples of Russia. And today, many of those peoples, those indigenous peoples of Russia, are facing sequential arrests, lengthy prison sentences. In certain cases, some are incarcerated in psychiatric asylums. And I was hoping that perhaps we could raise the issue of the arrests of those who stand up for indigenous rights of the indigenous peoples of Russia. And you previously read into the record the names of those who involved in the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, but Mr. Genser made it quite clear there's nothing worse than being arrested and being forgotten. So I thought it important to read some of those names into the record. However, I'm willing to table those names because I can see that the chair is limited in the amount of leeway he can provide me time-wise. So thank you, but perhaps you can comment on the current situation of the indigenous peoples, such as those in the Republic of Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Ingushetia, etc.
Mr. Karamurza, if I can have just 1 minute of a response to that, because I see we're out of time.
Very quickly, you're absolutely right. There is a relatively new clause in the Russian Criminal Code that officially penalizes quote-unquote separatist tendencies. So if, for example, one of the Russian regions were to try to do what Putin did in Crimea in 2014, the so-called referendum, the people who would organize it would all be liable for criminal prosecution under current Russian law. And yes, so there are many people in the regions, including many representatives of Russia's indigenous ethnic groups who are politically prosecuted and persecuted. But I think it's also important to state that in this sense, at least, the Putin regime is an equal opportunities persecutor. And if you look at the list of political prisoners in Russia, you will find representatives of many ethnic groups, many different religions, many different social walks of life. But of course, still, just as in Stalin's time, numerically, the largest group of them are the Russian people themselves.
Thank you very much. And with that, we shall adjourn.